Okay, so I guess we're just going to try this without a mic. If people are having trouble hearing me in the back, maybe just like kind of raise your hand and go like this, or come to the front, and we'll try to do the best we can under the circumstances. It's a pleasure to be here at Villanova. I've never been to Villanova. I'm really enjoying walking around the campus, and just got to meet some of the faculty in sociology, and we had a little talk. And I'm happy to be here to share with you some of the results of my research that I've been working on lately on the American college hookup scene. So what I want to do today is provide kind of a descriptive portrait of what I think is going on regarding sex, dating, relationships, hooking up in this college scene today. I'm going to focus largely on heterosexual students. My data have a lot more heterosexual students in them than gay or lesbian students, of course, but there are some, I have a few findings I'll share with you on queer students as well. And I'm going to also focus on, and this is one of the reasons for the focus on heterosexual students, where sometimes gender norms or gender inequality, I think, are kind of structuring what's going on. Now let me tell you a little bit about my study. I call it the Online College Social Life Study. It was an online survey of undergraduates. I started in 2005, and I say to the present, actually the last data were collected about 4 years ago, at 21 public and private four-year schools. Recruitment was mostly through sociology classes, but as you know, sociology classes are often taken by people as electives that aren't sociology majors, so actually less than 15% of the people are sociology majors. It's not a probability sample, which is kind of the gold standard in social science for making sure a sample is representative, so it's not perfectly representative of these 21 schools, but in most of the classes that hosted the survey, so what I did to do this was kind of using my contacts. I would get professors in different universities, especially that taught some big classes, to say, would you give a couple extra credit points or something to have your students take my online survey? And there was a way that we could capture their names such that I could tell the professor who actually took it, but then we scrubbed the names off for everybody's confidentiality. And in most of the classes, nearly 100% of the people took it, so it's not just like people that were really into hooking up, you know, self-selected into the survey or something. Pretty much everybody in the classes did it. So let me start out telling you a little bit about what kind of things I asked about. I asked about people's most recent hookup, their most recent date, and their most recent relationship that lasted at least 6 months since they've been to college. Now, why I asked about the most recent one is that if you only have time to ask about one, if you can ask, first of all, the more recent one you'll remember better, right? You know, if I ask you about a date that occurred 3 years ago, and then I ask you how many drinks did you have, that may be a lot harder to remember than something that's the most recent date you went on, depending on how many dates you go on, right? Also, it's been shown that specific behavioral questions reduce what we call social desirability bias. That is, people sort of answering what they think you want to hear, or what they think a good person would do, or a cool person or something. And in other words, if I ask you something like, on an average day, do you usually eat junk food? You're probably more likely to give me an answer biased by social desirability than if I ask you, yesterday, did you eat any junk food? And here's what I mean by junk food. The specific thing, you're more likely to tell the truth. And then we can say that if we have enough people, we'll get something that's kind of representative of what they do in a bunch of different events. Now, there's always this question of what do we mean by a hookup? And it's kind of one of the things that's amusing to me, having been studying. As you can see by looking at me, I'm pretty old. So I did not go to college during the era of the hookup. It was much more the era of a lot of dates. And students tend to have themselves somewhat vague definitions, but the term is used, so people mean something by it. And so in the survey, I did specify that I meant someone you weren't already in a relationship with. But other than that, it just said use whatever definition of hookup you and your friends use, which allows me to find out things like on things people call a hookup, like what actually happens sexually. You might be really interested in that, and we're going to get to that. And then the question was, how do I ask about some recent, quote, sexual event within relationships? And the problem here is that I didn't want to assume that every single set, couple, girlfriend, boyfriend couple were having intercourse, because some people don't believe in doing that, and some people, in fact, do have long relationships and not do it. Not very many, but it does happen. So I don't want to throw them out of the analysis, so I can't say the last time you and your significant other had sex, if by sex you mean intercourse and you've never done it. But I didn't want to get you're living with a partner practically, and last night they kissed your cheek, and then I'm going to ask about that as the event. So what I said was, can you tell me about the last time you did something sexual beyond kissing in that most recent relationship? And the reason I'm telling you this is that I'm sometimes going to show you some data on hookups compared to relationship events. And so this is what I mean by this event in the relationship. This is how I ask the questions. Okay, so first of all, how many students who were seniors, so we can say by their senior year, had hooked up at least once? About 70%, and it's about the same for men and women. So on the one hand, your typical person does hook up sometime. On the other hand, there's 30% of people that never have by their senior year. So what's actually happening sexually on these hookups? So this is when people were asked, tell me about your most recent hookup. And then I asked a bunch of questions about it. Was it with a male or a female? Was a person from your school? And then I said, what happened sexually? And there was this checklist, check all that apply. I mean, this is on the online survey. And included kissing and touching the breast or buttocks area of your partner. It didn't say whether clothed or unclothed. Then hand to genital stimulation, receiving or doing oral sex, receiving or giving, and intercourse. It also asked about anal sex. So in this graph, it's important in order to understand the graph that you understand that I'm classifying hookups. I've sort of got, if you'll forgive the term, a base system here. So for example, suppose you had a hookup and you kissed and you had oral sex and you had intercourse. Where am I going to put you in this chart? I'm going to put you at intercourse. In other words, I'm going to classify you by the thing toward the right, the farthest toward the right that you reported that you did. So when it says kiss touch here, it means that 35% of hookups involved no hand to genital stimulation, no oral sex, and no vaginal intercourse or anal intercourse. Okay? The hand to genital stimulation might have also involved, so they can always involve the things to the left, but not to the right. All right? So the interesting thing you find out here is what percent of hookups involve sexual intercourse? About 40%. What percent involve no genital behavior whatsoever? About 35%. Now I think oftentimes we sort of think the typical hookup is neither of those two, but is oral sex. But what you actually see here, of course some of the people that had intercourse also had oral sex, but it's actually a fairly small proportion of hookups that involve oral sex but not intercourse. I mean, it happens, that's why people talk about it, but it's not like the predominant category. So that's just kind of a picture of what is happening on the typical hookup. Now, it turns out that sometimes you're hooking up for the first time with this person, and sometimes you're not, right? So the blue bars here are what you just saw a minute ago. On all hookups, what proportion of people did these various things. The red bars here are on hookups where it was your first time hooking up with this partner, what occurred sexually. And what you see there is there's less intercourse and more just making out, basically. Which tells you that sometimes people, I mean, it sort of makes sense, right? Hook up with someone the first time, they don't have sex, but maybe they do the second time or the third time. Now, that raises the interesting question, how frequent are these repeat hookups, right, with the same person? So here's a graph. So I asked in the survey, how many times they're reporting on one hookup, their most recent, right? How many times had you previously hooked up with this same person? So 0 would mean it was my first hookup with this person. And so you see that almost half of hookups, this is the first time I hooked up, which probably tells you that a lot of times people never, a lot of hookups people never repeat with the same person. But there is a very non-trivial amount of cases. In fact, about half are second or higher order, although the farther you get down the line, the less frequent it is. Partly because at some point, some of these sequences of hookups turn into relationships, and then people probably, well, if they followed my instructions in the survey, if it was, they hooked up with someone 3 times and then it turned into a relationship, and then they're maybe having sex or some kind of sexual behavior in that relationship, that's not going to get reported as a hookup since, the question, if they're reading the questions carefully, and I know people always read the questions very carefully on online surveys, right? Not always, but they wouldn't be characterizing this as a hookup. So an interesting question is how often are hookups, some complete stranger, you just went to some party on campus, you never met this person before, or how often are they people that you know? Well, you can see here that it's a very small minority that are complete strangers. It happens, it's 13%. But people usually say they knew the person either a little bit or moderately or pretty well. So then there's the question of how drunk people were. You can do means or medians. Those of you taking statistics will know that the difference between these two, median is the 50th percentile, mean is the average. They're often the same. Anyhow, for women it's 4 either way. For men, if you take the mean, it's 6. If you take the median, it's 5. By the way, a little thing you'll learn in a statistics class, it's when a distribution is really skewed out with the long, skinny right-hand tail that the mean is bigger than the median. So that tells you there's a few guys out there, that have really out there that have had, 22 drinks or something like that. Now, public health people have these definitions of what's binge drinking and what isn't, and they say 4 for women and 5 for men, they call binge drinking. So by this definition, the average hookup is entailing binge drinking. Now, another interesting question about hookups is how often are people interested in a relationship with each other or not interested, and does this differ between men and women? So I think there's kind of a, I'll say, stereotype or idea out there that, all the girls are interested in relationships and the guys aren't interested in relationships at all, or something close to that. Well, clearly that's not true here because before the hookup, more than 1/3 of the guys are interested in a possible relationship with this person. 35% are not interested, which means that the majority did have some interest. I got that right? Yeah, I always forget which way I'm percentaging here. After the hookup, actually you see both men and women are sort of losing interest between the before and after the hookup a little bit. So a lot of people do have some interest in a relationship. That's true for both men and women. Now, the kernel of truth in this absolute stereotype, you know, all men want only sex, all women want a relationship, not casual sex. The kernel of truth is that there is a higher proportion of men than women by about 10 percentage points, either before or after, that are not interested in a relationship. So more women than men are interested in a relationship, but there's a lot of both sexes that are, and there's this significant minority of both sexes that aren't. A lot of times we talk about the hookup culture in terms of, you know, the date being dead, right? Now, some terminology here, and I'm looking out on a mostly student audience. I don't really need to tell you this because you probably know this. I need to tell the old people this, you know, there's a few of them in the audience. And I learned this from, you know, I was like anthropologist from Mars, you know, studying this actually I did a lot of qualitative interviews of students too, but as well as looking at the data on this online survey. But in talking with students, it's clear that this word dating is used really to mean you're in a relationship. You know, if you say, are you guys dating? That usually means, are you in a relationship, right? Or are you exclusive, or other words that are used, you know, are you Facebook, in a relationship, et cetera. A lot of drama around that, right? And as we'll see in a minute, relationships certainly haven't died on campuses. But prearranged dates among people not already in an exclusive relationship, I think are rarer than decades ago. Now, I should say my data can't tell us that because my data are all very recent. And we don't have really comparable data going back, you know, 1 decade, 2 decades, 3 decades, 4 decades. But I think arranged dates were more of the scene that was going on decades ago. Today, dates sometimes come after hookups, after 1 or 2 hookups, when there is some interest in something more. And I also think are often a way that a person, usually the guy, signals interest in a relationship. Oops, I keep pushing the wrong button here. Now, actually, people tend to talk about it like, oh, everything's all hookups today, no dates. Again, I think the date has declined, but that's a gross exaggeration. In fact, I asked students, how many hookups with someone you're not already in a relationship with have you been on since you came to college? And then I asked, how many dates have you been on? And the difference isn't that great. So again, just to keep time frame clear, I'll just look at data on seniors here. Except when I tell you this is just data on seniors, I'm always using all the data. But I just went up to seniors, so they've all had like about 4 years of exposure. So the typical person, or the average person, has had 8 hookups and 7 dates and 2 relationships. So actually, you know, if you have any idea that by hookup culture I mean the average person is, you know, hooking up 30 times a year or something, there are such people, but if seniors have an average of 8, you know, that's like 2 per year, right, at the average. And it's a similar number for dates. About 66% of men, well, exactly 66% of men and 74% of women said they had been in a relationship of 6 months. And here again, I'm looking at seniors, so we're talking about you've had about 4 years of exposure. I think there's a reason why this number is higher for women than men. I mean, it could be some misreporting, like there's always a little ambiguity, like what is a relationship, when are we in a relationship? And so women may be construing some situations to be relationships that men don't construe to be relationships. That's possible. But the other thing going on is that I can see in my data that a lot more junior and senior women than men are in relationships with people who are not students at their college. Now, I failed to ask about what's the age of your partner, but I think what's going on there is, since it's more, the social norm is that if someone's going to be older, it's the guy. More young women that are juniors or seniors might be dating someone who's already out of college, and you're going to get, and that may pull more of them into reporting relationships. I mean, because there actually are relationships there. All right, so now I want to talk about something that you usually don't talk about in polite company, but I think is very important: orgasm. Because, of course, orgasm, it's not the be-all or end-all of sex, but it's very pleasurable when it happens. And so, we have a lot of research among people studying gender on, the sex gap in pay, right, or the glass ceiling, can women get up to these top managerial positions? But I'm kind of interested in the sex gap in orgasms, right? Seems like an important thing to look at. So what this is telling you is the percent of, on the left side of the graph, men who had orgasms in these different contexts, and over on the right, women. Now, the contexts that I'm looking at are either your first hookup with a person. So I took all those most recent hookups where they said it was my first time with this person. Or a second or third hookup with the same person, that's the red bars. Or a fourth or higher order hookup with the same person, that's the dark gold bar. Or this questions asked about your most recent relationship and the most recent sexual event beyond just kissing. I didn't use the geeky phrase sexual event in the question. I said, tell me about the last time you did something beyond kissing with this significant other, and then I asked a bunch of questions about what happened sexually, and one of them was, did you have an orgasm? So, if you compare the male blue bar to the female blue bar, and in other words, if you take same kind of event and always compare the male to female, you will see that men are always having more orgasm than women in any particular kind of event. But what may not be easy to see here visually, the other thing you can see is that for both men and women, they're more likely to have an orgasm in a second or third or fourth hookup than in a first one. That is, the more times you've hooked up with the person, the more likely you are to have an orgasm. But you're most likely to have an orgasm, and this is true for both men and women, if it's a relationship. Now, I think there's a bunch of reasons for this. One reason is very mundane. It's like people do more sexual stuff that might produce orgasm in second and third hookups than they do in first hookups, and they do the most stuff in relationships, right? So, remember, a bunch of these hookups involve nothing besides making out. So I don't know about you, but I'm not sure most of us can have an orgasm from making out. Welcome. This guy's probably wondering, what did I walk into here? Is this like Sexuality 101. Okay, so partly this just reflects what sexual behaviors are occurring in these different events. That is, the within gender elevation of the bars. But there's also another thing which you could think of as partner-specific practice, right? That, one of the things people say is good about sex in marriage, there may be a lot of problems about it, but one of the things that's good is you have this one partner and you get a lot of practice with them. And so you kind of learn what they like. and hopefully they learn what you like or what works for you. And sometimes we need this kind of partner-specific learning in order to have an orgasm. So I think that that's both why relationships entail more orgasm, but also why, fourth and fifth hookups entail more than second or third time because remember, it's with this partner, and both of those entail. And actually, I can show those of you who do multiple regression, if you're really studying statistics, I can show in a regression that controlling for what behaviors occurred, you see this same pattern of higher order hookups are more likely to produce orgasm, even controlling for the behavior, and relationships the most likely to. But then a final thing about why we would expect relationships possibly to produce orgasm more is that, part of what we mean by a relationship is that you care about this person, right? And when people care about each other more, they're more likely to be trying to please their partner. And that may be true for both men and women. So I think that's another reason why you see more orgasm in relationships. Now, a final thing you can take off this graph, but it's hard for you to see it. If I were to make a ratio of men's blue bar to women's, men's red bar to women's, and say, in other words, how big is the gender gap in orgasm, and what you can see, first of all, what you can see easily is that for any type of event, more men than women are having orgasms, right? See that? The blue here is higher than the blue there. The green here is higher than the green there. But what you cannot see until you do some arithmetic from this is that the ratio of the female bar to the male bar is actually higher in relationships than in hookups. So there's a worse gender gap in orgasm in hookups than in relationships. So in that sense, relational sex seems more egalitarian in a gender sense. Now, you might say, who cares? Do women care about orgasm? Of course, individuals will differ, but I also ask people how much they enjoyed these sexual events. And using a statistical technique where I'm predicting that from a bunch of things, controlling a bunch of things, including did the person have an orgasm, it's a wildly big and statistically significant effect. So women are saying they enjoyed these events much more if they had an orgasm. Men too, by the way, but it's women about whom people seem to doubt this sometimes. So I don't think that just not caring about it is the reason that women are reporting less orgasm than men. That's not to say that there isn't a factor of if women get used to sex being conducted in ways that isn't very conducive to their orgasm, or they have the idea that they're going to look like a bad person if they use any kind of agency to ask for what they want. They may come to accept this and kind of not expect to have an orgasm and not think it's okay for them to, if they are engaging in these sexual behaviors, that it's not okay for them to ask for what they want. And that may be another factor in how sex doesn't get conducted in a way that's conducive to their orgasm. Now, another factor is in the orgasm gap is sort of non-reciprocal oral sex. So what I'm looking at here, before I was telling you like what % of hookups had oral sex, but what I'm looking at here is when hookups occur, is it, we both received oral sex, only one partner did, only the other partner did. And I'm comparing here same-sex hookups, women with women or men with men, to other sex hookups, in other words, heterosexual hookups. Well, I'm not classifying by what the person said their sexual orientation is, but if it's a male-female hookup, it's over here. If it's a female-female, it's in the second trio of bars, and if it's a male-male, it's here. So the interesting thing is, so it's when the middle bar, which is both received, I'm sorry, it's always the middle bar, the red bar. It's when the red bar is real high that's telling you the really common pattern is reciprocal oral sex, if oral sex happens. And I'm also looking at events where there was no intercourse, by which I mean vaginal intercourse or anal sex. In the case of male-female, it's usually vaginal intercourse. And in the case of men with same-sex partners, anal intercourse. In the case of lesbians, this is kind of irrelevant. So they're all included. So the fact that the highest red bar is male-male hookups is telling you that men hooking up with men is the group that has the most reciprocal pattern of oral sex. The next most reciprocal is, you got the same graph here, I'm just putting more text over here, is women hooking up with women. So the heterosexual hookups are the least reciprocal. And this is probably one, maybe not huge, but one factor in this orgasm gap that we're seeing in hookups. Now, another thing I want to talk about is whether people feel that they're respected by their partners that they hook up with, and whether they respect their partners that they hook up with. So the question that was asked is, have you ever hooked up with someone and afterwards respected them less because they hooked up with you? You know, it's sort of a weird concept, right? I'm going to try to talk someone into doing this thing with me, and then I didn't tell them in advance, but I'm going to respect them less if they do it, even though I was trying to get them to do it. But it happens. And then the other question was, have you ever hooked up with someone and felt that your hookup partner respected you less, and that one also said, because you hooked up with them? So what you see here is that, first if we say, have you ever disrespected your own hookup partner because they hooked up with you? It's not the typical thing. It's the minority for both sexes, but 10 percentage points more of men than women say, yeah, I've hooked up with someone and then I didn't respect them because they hooked up with me. Now, so that's more common for men than women. On the flip side, it's wildly more common for women than men to feel like their hookup partner didn't respect them. So we can talk, and maybe we're going to have a little time here in discussion to talk about this in a few minutes, because I'm nearing the end. But I think one reason for this disparity in respect is what sociologists sometimes call the double standard of sexuality, whereby if women, it used to be the old norm was if women had sex outside of marriage, they were really looked down upon, and men weren't supposed to do it either, but they weren't looked down upon as much. That was kind of the double standard when my mother was growing up. I think today's double standard is about casual or non-relational sex, that if women are seen to be doing too much of this, they're seen as, well, you know what that word is that's used, right? They're seen as sluts. If guys are seen to be doing a lot of casual sex, what word do we use? Now, sometimes people talk about, call him a man whore or something like that, but what other words do we have? Yeah, stud, player, whatever. The point is, it's not as pejorative in general. So I think that's part of what's going on. Now, let's talk about sort of a grim topic. People experiencing sexual assault. I know there's been a lot of talk about this on campuses lately, and a lot of campuses are ginning up some training about this. I just want to show you what data I got from my survey. I asked 3 questions trying to get at sexual assault. I didn't use the word rape or sexual assault, and not all of these would meet a legal standard, but I asked these questions. Have you had sexual intercourse that was physically forced on you? Then I asked, has someone tried to physically force you to have sexual intercourse, but you got out of the situation without having intercourse? And then I asked, have you had sexual intercourse that you didn't want when you were drunk, passed out, asleep, drugged, or otherwise incapacitated? And then here's the percent of women saying yes to that by what year in school. So just flip over again to the seniors. So at 4 years of exposure, 10% of women are saying they've been physically forced. 15% is saying someone tried to, but they got out of it. 11% are saying they've had sex they didn't want when they were incapacitated. Now, then this bottom panel is just various combinations. So if the very bottom row and right-hand side is what percent of women that were seniors said yes to one of these 3 things? And the answer is 25%. Now, it's very interesting. There's all these surveys floating around and stuff. And people, if you ask kind of general questions like this, you'll tend to get numbers about like this. This is what the other studies are showing. Now, here's an interesting thing. So it's a big problem, I would say. And, you know, even if these wouldn't always meet a legal standard, or maybe it's a little too high or a little too low. I mean, the point is, there's a lot of people involved here. So the other thing I want to point out is that men were answering this question too, and we tend to look at this question just with respect to women. And a lot more women than men say yes to these questions. But you might be expecting the men, at least the heterosexual men, to be, you know, be close to 0. But actually, it's like about half what the women are. So I think we need to study that a little bit more. There are a bunch of men saying that they've had unwanted sex with women as well. And I think we need to look at that as well. There's also a lot of gay men saying that they have been coerced, you know, had these things happen with men. And bisexual men as well, maybe saying that there are not very many people saying, women who are saying they've been coerced by women. Not that it's never happening, but it's much rarer. So I want to end on something a little bit lighter than sexual assault. This graph is hard to read. Oh God, it's really hard to read. That really screwed up. Okay, I'm just going to show you 2 bars, which, yeah, you can't follow this at all. So let me just tell you what it shows. You know, this is funny. There's something about this little labels down here. We had them going that way, and then my RA fixed it, and obviously it didn't work. We asked these questions about what sexual behaviors have you ever done with a man, have you ever done with a woman? So, you know, there's been all this talk lately about girls kissing girls on the dance floor, and, you know, these are mostly straight women, and what's up with that, and all that stuff. So I was sort of interested in that phenomenon. And I was particularly interested in, I think sometimes that's an exploration of women that are interested in possible sex and romance with women. Other times it's just done for male titillation, and it's kind of an accepted thing, although not so accepted for guys to do it, right? Kiss guys on the dance floor and like, ha ha ha, I'm still straight. Whereas a lot of women do say they are. So I asked, have you ever kissed a woman in private? Have you ever kissed a woman in public? So I thought among women, the difference between those two might reflect, you know, who really has an interest in romantic or sexual relationships with women versus who's just doing this for display because guys think it's cool or whatever. And indeed, among women who call themselves heterosexual, there's, which is one of these bars over here, there's a lot more women saying that they've kissed a woman in public than saying they've kissed a woman in private, which is sort of what I expected. And there's other interesting things you can see on this graph, but you can't read it. So I'm going to close there by saying that it took me a lot of work to collect this data over 6 years, and I give it out freely to people to use for research. I've used it in my own research, but there's other people using it as well. And if you were like doing an honors thesis and you know some statistics and can use SPSS or Stata or something and wanted to use these data and thought you could study some interesting things, you're welcome to do so. If you're a professor and would like to use it for your own research or to illustrate something in a class, if you send me an email, you can go straight to this website, or you can just send me an email, Paula England, just go to NYU Sociology website, you'll find my email. I would be happy to give it out. So I would love to close with that and hear some questions and comments from you, maybe about what's going on at Villanova with respect to these things. So thanks for your attention. So I am open for questions or comments. Yes?
How does self-satisfaction compare to the amount of orgasm you receive?
They're strongly positively related. You know, you can do this statistical analysis and show that it's a strong predictor of satisfaction. Now, sometimes people are quite satisfied even though they didn't have one, but they're much more likely to be satisfied if they did. Yeah. Yeah, in the back.
What are your thoughts on the disparity between the male versus female responses?
On what? With
You had the one graph up before, and at the bottom there were like twice as many female responses as male.
Could you repeat the question?
He's asking, why do I have more women in my sample than men? It's almost twice as many. Yeah, good eye. Because they were done in sociology classes. It's about sex segregation of majors. Sociology classes, it's not, actually there are only 15% sociology majors, but they were almost all done in sociology classes, and they're taken more by women than men. Any comments from students about some parts of what I portrayed that seems to you very different from what you see on your campus? I mean, Villanova was not one of the schools in this study, but it's a mix of schools. There's like flagship, like, I'll just tell you some of the schools that are in there. UMass is in there, Ohio State, University of Arizona, a couple UCs, Riverside and Santa Barbara. Then I've got some little liberal arts colleges, Whitman College. There's a couple of more, SUNY Stony Brook is in there. Penn is actually in there. So it's a mix of public and private, and you know, I don't think they're real atypical. No one wants to comment on the Villanova scene.
I was at this party, right, and I was actually sober, and there were some girls who were intoxicated, you know, like, they'd be making up stories, because these girls, I'm not even that desirable, I'm probably like a 5 out of 10, kind of ugly, and these girls, they were like actually touching me. I was like, yo, you can just chill. They just kept touching me and coming on me. I was actually sitting on a couch, but some girls just like jumped on me. So I would be one of the yeses that think girls are like sexually abusive or whatever.
You know, it's interesting that, yeah, we tend to have this idea that, you know, men are the ones always trying to initiate sex, and I think that's true on average, partly. I mean, some people think there's some evolutionary reason for that. That might be true, it might not be true, I don't know. But I think part of it is women have been so trained that they're going to be judged negatively if they're seen to be coming on to people or too assertive and stuff. But despite that, some women do show sexual agency now, and maybe fewer than men, but they do, and sometimes they get judged for it, right? I mean, an interesting question to me is, and I'm not giving, I'm trying to be a scientist here, so I'm not giving my values about all this, which you probably don't care about. But I am interested in whether the standard is double or not, right? Because you could have a double standard saying it's okay for everybody to have casual sex. I'm sorry, you could have a single standard which says it's okay for everybody to have casual sex. You could have a single standard saying everybody should be a virgin till marriage, or something in between, but the same for men and women. And then you can have a double standard, and then it's kind of interesting to look scientifically at, well, why do we get this double standard? Because I think we have one, and also, what are the consequences of it? Yeah.
Sorry, I had a question.
Yes.
With the survey about physical assault, we were asking like freshmen and sophomores. I noticed that the percentages were decreasing with every consecutive year. When you asked them about the experiences, did you mean just like within their entire college experience?
Right. Good question. Good question. Good eye. So, yeah, she's saying she noticed in my graph about sexual assault that the numbers go up by year. And she didn't understand if, and I didn't clarify this, am I saying 4% of sophomore, or 5% of sophomores were said yes to that question for behavior that occurred during their sophomore year? No. The question was always, since you started college, have you, everything, since you started college, have you had sexual intercourse that was physically forced on you? Since you started college. So, therefore, the numbers either have to go up or stay the same, right? I mean, if we were following the same people, actually what I'm doing is just taking the people that were freshmen when they were sophomores, then the juniors, then the seniors, but I'm assuming that that's telling us the sequencing. So actually, if anything, this says it's more likely to happen in your freshman year, because look, from freshman, like look at physical force attempted. Freshmen report 10% report they had it. By senior year, it's only 15%. So there was only half as much in the last 3 years as was experienced in the first year. And some people have written about this, that freshman year is a particular site of danger for young women because they're coming to these campuses new and they want to be cool and go do what people do and go to the parties, and they don't know, what's going on and things like that. Yes, sir.
Did anyone in your data set identify as transgender, or is it all just men and women?
Yes, I had a question, actually the sex question, that is the question about, your sex, had categories: male, female, M to F, trans, F to M, trans. And there are some in the data set, but only like out of 20,000, I think maybe we have 35 or something. So I can't remember in these statistics if I threw them out or put them in the sex they identify with now. But it doesn't really matter because the numbers are so small. It's an important area for research, and it's hard to do with this kind of surveys because, like, if you think, like, lesbians are a small category or bisexual women are a small category, they're much bigger than the number of transgender folk. So I can't really do much with the data. Yeah, but there were some. Yes, in the back.
One of the interesting things about the very bottom row there, the 14, 18, 25%, so for seniors, basically 25% of all the seniors, women you surveyed, have had one of either physical force
Right.
or attempted rape.
That's what they report, yeah.
That's a quarter of all the
That's right.
years. And that does not include all their years of life prior to college. So maybe
Right.
what would the percentage be for women?
In terms of counting anything that happened in high school or something.
Have you ever had things happen in your life?
Yeah. And, that's an interesting question. And to be honest, it could be that some people counted something that happened in high school. I mean, the instructions said otherwise. It said since you came to college, but sometimes people forget the intro to the questions. But you're right. I mean, I think the point is there's a lot of debate now in the media about, oh, these numbers inflated and stuff. And one thing we know is if you call it a crime survey, you get much lower numbers. Or if you use the word rape or sexual assault, say, have you been a victim of rape, you get smaller numbers. But surveys that ask questions something like this, in a lot of places are coming up with numbers something like this. And I wouldn't stand by the exact number or something, but the point is, if it's somewhere between 15% and a quarter, that's, that strikes me as a pretty big problem. So yeah, I think it really warrants our attention. And so lots of individual campuses are doing their own surveys now to try to get some figures on this. Yes?
Did you include any Catholic universities in your study? And if you did the statistics change at all?
Yeah, good question. I do not think, I have one. What's the Catholic school that's in that town in Montana? Do you know what's the name of it is? No, it's a really beautiful place. I went there and gave a talk. That school is in there, although the numbers from there are small enough. So the real answer is I don't know from my data, but I have read things about this from other people that are studying it, and everything I read, for example, there's a qualitative study on hookup culture that used your nearby neighbors, St. Joe's, That's not revealed in the book, but it's really a combination of St. Joe's and Delaware are the two places she studied it. And there was quite a vigorous hookup culture going on. My sense is, if I look at data on does it matter if the student is Catholic or not, I don't see any differences. My sense is the place that's a little different are evangelical schools, evangelical Protestant schools, where there's sort of less of all this stuff going on. My sense is that Catholic schools aren't that much different, but you can't really tell it from my data. Yeah, in the back.
Yeah, I just wondered if you think the hookup culture at schools like Villanova, where schools where there's more joining is different from a school like NYU or like Ruger or like Amy, where more people are commuters.
Oh, yeah, actually, there is some research on this. Commuter schools seem to have less of a hookup culture, partly because it is I think there's two reasons. It's facilitated by, whether you think it's a good thing or a bad thing, it's facilitated by on-campus parties and also by sometimes at fraternities, but not always at fraternities. Or, slightly off campus, like people that are living in just apartments off. But when you're living at home 15 miles away in your parents' house, you could be going into those parties on Friday night, but you don't tend to be as much. So, for example, University of Illinois at Chicago is in my sample, and it's a classic commuter school. And you have much less rates of hooking up. Sometimes just as much, not necessarily less people that have had sex, and you might be more likely to have people getting in relationships earlier, but not as much of kind of party-driven hookups. So I think the other thing about why I think actually you can almost even get more of it going on smaller schools is that it gives people a sense of trust. Actually, the author who wrote this book, the data from which some of are really from St. Joe's, commented on this, that people feel safe. Like you're at a party at a dorm or at a frat or something, and somebody asks you to go upstairs in their room, and you're a young woman. You don't feel like this guy's going to turn into Jack the Ripper when he shuts the door, although sometimes that happens, but you don't feel like it because, you're in this space where there's a bunch of other students. Also, if you tell your friends that he did this, it's going to get back to his friends, and so sort of social networks may police this a little bit. So people feel a lot more secure. Now, sometimes that feeling of security may be false, but I think it sort of facilitates this whole hookup culture. This author I was mentioning, her name is Bogle is her last name, who wrote this book on from qualitative data on the hookup culture. She also, one thing I really liked in the design of her research is she interviewed alums from the same schools, and that were living in the city that these schools are near, and the alums are dating a lot more. Now, part of this is they're older, they're more ready to find a mate, maybe get married. But the other reason guys would tell her for why they're dating more after college relates to this feeling of safety thing. She said, you know, guys will tell me, look, if I'm going to a bar and then I meet some woman, if I say, yeah, want to get in my car and come home with me to my apartment, they are going to think this is Jack the Ripper, or it could be, right? They're simply not going to do it. They don't have a feeling of safety if they meet this stranger in a bar, or oftentimes they are not willing to do it in a way that wasn't true when I was at college. So they say, if I want to get anything going, I'm going to have to ask the person's number, call them up, have an actual date, you know, etc. So I think this sense of safety in a smaller community is one thing that that facilitates it. Yes. Yeah, you know, you can see in the data a bunch of freshmen that are talking about events that are not with, or relationships that are not with someone from their college. And I think, I mean, of course, sometimes they last all 4 years, right? But I think a lot of those are the hometown, you know, boyfriend, girlfriend. But I don't have a lot of qualitative data on kind of what happens. I think a lot of those relationships break up at some point. What was your interest in that topic? I mean, what do you think happens a lot of times?
I was just wondering because as a freshman, like I see there's probably more people in my grade than other grades that I relate to.
Right. And that's because they're still in the relationship that they had with their high school girlfriend, boyfriend, who either went to another college or is a year behind them maybe, right? And is still back in the high school. And I think you see less of those in later years because a lot of them don't last. But some do, yeah. Yes?
How does Tinder render the definition of dating more complex? Like, is
Yeah.
Tinder, when you meet your Tinder person, are you on a date or are you
Or you want to hook up, right?
or are you on a hookup or what are you doing?
Yeah, and you know, I haven't studied that. I mean, here's my take on that. I think the online dating things like, you know, Match and certainly eHarmony and but even, you know, Match and OkCupid and stuff. I think most of what's going on there is dates, although there's going to be a certain proportion of people that are just looking for a quick sexual liaison, and this is the technology available. Now, Tinder and these other things kind of really up the ante for the possibility of quick stuff because they're actually looking at who's available right now in some geographical radius, right? And so I think the Tinder type thing is much more likely to be hookups, and whether that's actually having some effect on increasing casual liaisons, I don't know. But it certainly is kind of set up to facilitate that, right? Because it wouldn't be relevant, is this person within a 6-block radius right now if I wasn't thinking of doing something right now, right? Whereas on Match.com or something, which I should disclose I myself met my significant other on, years after a divorce, yeah. And the relationship's been going for 10 years. There, of course, people sort by geography, but that's more like I don't want to be in a relationship with a person that I have to commute to Chicago, to see. It's not about can we get together in the next 1 hour, right? And that isn't how things are usually set up. I mean, you could in principle use Match that way, and it probably, and OkCupid is the more recent one. Yeah, the whole question of is the technology changing things? I think it's definitely changed the possibility of relationship formation for people in kind of thin markets. It's used, online stuff is used more by gay than straight people, and it's used more by, say, middle-aged adults, like, say, that are divorced or never got married and or never got in a relationship. Or, well, actually, the typical person has been in a relationship, but the point is, if you're a college student and you're straight, you probably don't use OkCupid that much because you don't need to. You're never going to have, I mean, some people do, but it's pretty rare, at least in my data, it's pretty rare because you don't need to. You're never going to have such a great field of eligible people your age, most of whom are single, right there where you can meet them. So it's people that are having trouble meeting people, and you know, people that are single or divorced in their 40s and 50s and 60s are in a situation where most of the people they know are married, or most of the people in their workplace are married. So I think online dating really facilitated that. But the Tinder type things, you know, they facilitate these more casual things. Are they only getting an acceptance because there already is an acceptance in some subpopulation of doing this, or are they actually pushing it? It's hard to know. I'm very skeptical of these ideas of, you know, technology having this dramatic effect. Like, I'm very skeptical of all this talk about, you know, because of iPhones and texting, no one's going to talk to anyone anymore, or you know, texting doesn't count as a social relationship and communication. That doesn't seem right to me, but it is an interesting, but I haven't looked at that. Any final question? Yes?
We looked, like, I wasn't aware when I read the article about hooking up.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know that you asked a question about, you know, respect and how women felt that their hookup partner
Yeah.
thought that they respected them.
More so than men, yeah.
More so than men. So, you know, like, we looked at this as the abolition of the double standard, but, like, could women really be the ones, like, enforcing that double standard, being that they just feel that way?
Well, they're saying they feel men disrespect them. So I don't see how that puts them in this seat of being the enforcer of the double standard.
I don't know. I just feel like, you know, it just kind of goes around and women are thinking that and just kind of, you know.
Well, it may be, I mean, it is true that you could see in that chart that more women were thinking that guys disrespected them proportionally than guys said they disrespected their hookup partner, right? So that may mean that women have a sense of being disrespected when guys aren't disrespecting them. That's possible. I don't think that means they're the ones enforcing the double standard, but it may mean partly they're seeing something that isn't always there. That's possible. I don't know. My sense is that there's still, I mean, it's interesting because in one sense you're right. We talk about the hookup thing as, well, if it's seen as okay for women to have these casual liaisons, that must mean we're rid of the double standard. But I think it's all much more gray and blurry than that. It's sort of okay, but not everybody thinks it's okay, and a lot of people think, well, it's okay until you do too much of it, and what counts as too much of it may really be seen as different for women than men. So I actually think it is this kind of limbo zone where women have new freedoms, but they're also much more vulnerable to judgment, social judgment, than men. And that, in that sense, there still is really a double standard. Yeah. Yes?
I guess as a final comment, I
Sure.
actually gave a speech last year on using your data.
Oh, really?
Yeah, literally.
That's wild.
One of your talks that you gave, it was on YouTube, so.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I got to use your data as just my background.
Uh-huh.
And it was on hookup culture, and what I found interesting, I
Mhm.
And the most interesting part of the data I got was actually defining hookup culture and how people at Villanova defined it, because it varied so much. A lot of people either, I guess the way it varied is that either people thought it was everything but sex,
Mm.
or it was sex.
Right,
You know, so
right.
it was very hard in continuing my speech and preparing for it with that type of data, because a lot of people just thought either or, and it was some in between.
Right. And it is interesting how a term that's in common usage is almost deliberately vague, you know. But I still do think that most students, and you know, correct me if you think I'm wrong, when they use the term mean something like, this wasn't a prearranged date, something physical happened. Now what the something is and what counts on that is not so clear. And there was no necessary assumption of an interest in a relationship, although that's not precluded either, right? I mean, I think that is as specific, that's the thing that I think most people mean by it. But then when you get more specific than that, you're right, everybody seems to be operating off a different, and you'll see this in kids talking to each other, you know, like I was, at one point I was doing this research, so I was interviewing my nieces and nephews. My nephew said, well, you know, whenever a friend of mine comes in and says, well, I hooked up last night, I say, define hookup. This guy's now working on Wall Street doing spreadsheets, you know, and stuff, so he's a defined kind of guy. But so there is a lot of vagueness about it, and yet the term is in popular use, right? It's not like I just made up this term as a sociologist. I mean, in fact, I started this research because I was teaching at Northwestern, and a student came to my office and said he wanted to do a senior research project on why Northwestern students don't date, which he assumed was something idiosyncratic to Northwestern. And I said, they don't? This is in about 2002. And then I went to my class that day, and I looked down my class, and I said, student came to my office and said, Northwestern students don't date. Is that true? And people said, well, not very much, and stuff. And then this one guy in the front row raised his hand and said, have you heard of a hookup? I said, no, what's that? So my street cred, you know, kind of went to zero there. And the guy ended up doing the project and doing these interviews and everything, and I kind of learned a little bit of what's going on, and I was like, whoa, I need to study this. So clearly the term, you know, is in common usage, but it has this vague meaning. Thank you so much for your attention and your questions and comments.